I get to welcome you to our beautiful Owen McKiernan Library, nestled in the heart of the Celtic Junction Arts Center. We are Minnesota's Irish Cultural Center, poised in the Twin Cities in an area called the Midway. We straddle more than geography. We straddle the new and old, industrial and residential, thriving and struggling. This is one of the most diverse areas in Minnesota, and along University Avenue, only blocks from the unrest following the murder of George Floyd. We are compelled by the current events in our city and around the world as a community to take this opportunity on the 175th anniversary of Frederick Douglass's escape to Ireland to prompt our community to reflect on history, on solidarity, and racial justice, and to give voice to those who can lead us forward in that discussion. We've brought some of those voices together tonight. Firstly, our presenter on Frederick Douglass is Professor Christine Kinealy. She's director of Quinnipiac's Great Hunger Institute. You'll hear more about her shortly. Our lead panelist is Dennis Brownlee, an Emmy Award-winning filmmaker of the brilliant piece you will see tonight, Agitate, 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 and founder of the African-American Irish Diaspora Network. Other panelists include Grace Odumosu. She is the Irish Community Services Youth and Family Engagement Coordinator. She was born and raised in Dublin, Ireland, emigrated to Chicago in 2014, and has an extensive background in theater in both cities. E.G. Bailey is a Minnesota-based artist, director, filmmaker, activist, and a spoken word artist. He is currently visiting us from the Guthrie Theater, where he is in production. Closing the event will be Dakota Dave Hull. He is a musician. You might know him from the KFAI program he spent 20 years doing, specializing in historical Civil War, civil rights, and protest songs. Now, before we get started, it is my pleasure to introduce our Consul General to the Midwest, United States. He is newly appointed in September. He served in the Department of Foreign Affairs since 2010, stationed in the EU Division. He was in Ireland's consulate in San Francisco and in the Department of the Taoiseach. He is a graduate of Trinity College Dublin, the London School of Economics, and a Naughton Scholar. Kevin and his husband Aristotle are newly based in Chicago. Please welcome Kevin Byrne.
Thanks so much, and hello everyone. Firstly, my thanks to Natalie and everyone in Celtic Junction Arts Center for inviting the consulate to be part of this event. Across our mission network over the last number of months, we've been commemorating the 175th anniversary of Frederick Douglass's consequential first visit to Ireland and his meeting with our liberator, Daniel O'Connell. The US has played such an important role in Ireland's journey to independence, and America's struggle for civil rights in the 1960s sparked similar movements in Northern Ireland. So it's meaningful to reflect on the long connections between those in Ireland and those in the US who advanced the cause of civil rights and freedom, and also to remember Ireland's place in the story of one of America's strongest voices for racial equality and justice, Frederick Douglass. Particularly at this time, we can learn much from the example of Frederick Douglass and Daniel O'Connell, two men from very different places, but motivated and driven by the same belief in equality and liberty. The Ireland of today, long a country of mass emigration, now welcomes immigrants from around the world. Indeed, not many people know that 16% of Ireland's population is actually foreign-born. Reflecting on Douglass's legacy gives us in Ireland the opportunity to ask if we are as open, embracing, and inclusive a society as we could be, and whether we live up to the ideals espoused by Douglass and O'Connell. October is Black History Month in Ireland, so it's apt that we're reflecting on Douglass's legacy at this time. It also gives us the opportunity to reflect on our engagement with our diaspora and to ensure that we embrace all those with links and ties of heritage and affinity to Ireland, which is why I'm so happy to see Dennis Brownlee of the African-American Irish Diaspora Network on the panel today. Before closing, I just want to draw participants' attention to 10 Frederick Douglass scholarships that the Irish government is funding that give 10 outstanding students of colour the opportunity to participate in a special summer study tour of Ireland. There are more details on our Twitter page at Ireland Chicago. Now, it's my honour to introduce a short video that Dennis Brownlee and the African-American Irish Diaspora Network have put together on Douglass's life and his experience in Ireland. Agitate, agitate, agitate. Thank you.
I am Nettie Washington Douglass, the great-great-granddaughter of Frederick Douglass. Breaking free of enslavement, Frederick devoted his tremendous powers to rally a movement to abolish slavery and to fight for freedom, justice, and equality. Finding his voice, Frederick uniquely leveraged all aspects of culture to communicate the pain of enslavement and touch the heart of America. In 1845, just 7 years after claiming his own freedom, he brilliantly commented on the meaning of music to the enslaved.
Sometimes I feel like a motherless child.
I have often been utterly astonished since I came to the North to find persons who could speak of the singing among slaves as evidence of their contentment and happiness. It is impossible to conceive of a greater mistake. Slaves sing most when they are most unhappy. The songs of the slave represent the sorrows of his heart, and he is relieved by them only as an aching heart is relieved by its tears. I have often sung to drown my sorrow, but seldom to express my happiness.
A long way from home.
I've been frequently asked how I felt when I found myself in a free state. It was a moment of the highest excitement. This state of mind, however, very soon subsided. I was yet liable to be taken back and subjected to all the tortures of slavery.
Oh, the car emancipation rides majestic.
After escaping enslavement and moving north, Frederick's growing profile as an eloquent abolitionist put him in danger of recapture. He fled again, this time to Ireland.
One of the most pleasing features of my visit to Ireland has been a total absence of all manifestations of prejudice against me on account of my color. I find myself not treated as a color, but as a man, not as a thing, but as a child of the common father of us all.
In Dublin, Frederick met his hero, Daniel O'Connell, known as the Liberator and a leading international abolitionist.
I have just returned from a great repeal meeting held at Conciliation Hall. I've heard many speakers within the last 4 years, speakers of the first order, but I confess, I have never heard one by whom I was more completely captivated than by Mr. O'Connell.
In January of 1846, before leaving, Frederick reflected on his time in Ireland.
I can truly say I have spent some of the happiest moments of my life since landing in this country. I seem to have undergone a transformation. I live a new life.
Frederick was transformed by his 4 months in Ireland, a journey that led him to be an international champion of human rights.
He who really and truly feels for the American slave cannot steel his heart to the woes of others. And he who thinks himself an abolitionist yet cannot enter into the wrongs of others, as yet to find a true foundation for his anti-slavery.
Frederick returned to the U.S. in April 1847 as a free man, his freedom being purchased by British women abolitionists. He returned with new confidence and agency, determined to fight oppression wherever it existed.
In respect to political rights, we hold woman to be justly entitled to all we claim for man. All that distinguishes man as an intelligent and accountable being is equally true of woman. And there can be no reason in the world for denying to woman a hand in making and administering the laws of the land. Our doctrine is that right is of no sex.
Aged only 34, Frederick lectured in 1852 to the Rochester Ladies Anti-Slavery Society. Historians and humanists regard it as one of the greatest American speeches of all time.
What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him, more than all other days in the year, the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. There is not a nation on the earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloodier than are the people of these United States at this very hour.
Did America fight a civil war to defend the Union or to end slavery? The 1863 proclamation did not end slavery, but it forged a friendship between Frederick and President Lincoln. Still, the ending of the war brought disappointment.
I am for the immediate, unconditional, and universal enfranchisement of the black man in every state in the Union. Without this, his liberty is a mockery. For in fact, if he is not the slave of the individual master, he is the slave of society.
Frederick died in 1895 at the age of 77. In his final autobiography, he recalled his time overseas.
The friends of freedom in England and Ireland saw in the Negro a man, a moral and responsible being. In the name of humanity, they denounced the crime of his enslavement. It was the faithful, persistent, and enduring enthusiasm of William Wilberforce, Daniel O'Connell, and their noble co-workers that thawed the British heart into sympathy for the slave.
My great-great-grandfather Frederick was a breathtaking example of the power of transformation. His life was unparalleled in scope and impact. He still continues to be a voice for all time.
Wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. Gods are gonna trouble the water. Wade in the water, wade in the water.
Thank you so much, Dennis. That was not the first time I've seen that, and I hear something new in a completely different way every single time. It was brilliant, and I hope we get to hear more about how you came to that soon. But first, we go to our main presenter. Presenter Christine Kinealy. She is the founding director of Ireland's Great Hunger Institute at Quinnipiac. During the last decade, her research has explored the experience of abolitionists who visited Ireland in the 19th century, leading to many publications, particularly Frederick Douglass in Ireland in his own words. Her most recent book launch was just this week on additional abolitionists of Ireland. And what's close to our heart too is she's also the recipient of the 2017 Owen McKiernan Award as we sit in the Owen McKiernan Library here at the Junction. Christine, the floor is yours. Please take it away.
So thank you, Natalie. Thank you for putting this together. Thank you for inviting me to participate. I think this is a really exciting panel, and I'm delighted you started with the film, which I was happy to work with Dennis and some other colleagues on, Lenny and Becky. And it was also launched this week on Wednesday. So everything is very new. This has been quite a week and very appropriate because this is now coming to the end of Black History Month. So just, you've said, thank you for that introduction. I am sort of known for my work on the Great Famine, but that led me to working on Daniel O'Connell. My book on O'Connell and anti-slavery came out in 2010. At that point, somebody suggested, why don't you transcribe Frederick's speeches in Ireland? And I did. It took me 8 years, and it came out just 2 years ago as 2 volumes, because Frederick made 50 speeches when he was in Ireland. He didn't write any of them down, and he could speak without notes for 2 hours, and each speech was just brilliant. So during that time, I felt I got to know Frederick very well. But as I was studying Frederick, it also led me to realise, well, Frederick is probably the most famous Black abolitionist ever to come to Ireland or to Britain, but he was not the only one. So I started to research others, including women, very important. And so just as you heard this week, Black Abolitionists in Ireland was published. But that made me realize there are 10 Black abolitionists in this volume, that actually there are more. So I'm now working on the second volume. So the story just gets bigger and bigger. And I just want to say that each of these Black abolitionists is very different, but they are all equally brilliant. And even more brilliant when we realize that most of them, like Frederick, were self-educated. So I'm so glad, because when I started studying 10 years ago, the name Frederick Douglass wasn't so well known in Ireland. Fortunately, President Obama visited Ireland 2011, and in his speech at the front of Trinity College, he paid tribute to both Daniel O'Connell and to Frederick Douglass. And if you haven't seen his speech, it's on YouTube. It was magnificent. So for those of you who don't know, I know some of you know a lot of this, but who was Frederick Douglass? So just back to the basics. And he was born in Maryland in 1818. Of course, being a slave, he didn't know his year of birth. He didn't know his date. As an older man, he chose the 14th of February. His mother, who he met very few times, at one point called him her little Valentine. So he felt a great association with St. Valentine's Day. And his birth name was Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. And we are in the company of E.G. Bailey. And I'm wondering, could you be related? You need to do a DNA check, maybe. And we know that Frederick later changed his name to Frederick Douglass. So he, as a young boy, his mother died when he was 5 or 6. He was brought up by his grandmother. And age 7 or 8, he was taken to be companion to a little boy. And the woman of the household was, in Frederick's words, very kind to him. And when she was teaching her own little boy to read and write, she also taught Frederick, until her husband intervened and pointed out it was illegal, on the grounds that an educated slave would be an unhappy slave. But Frederick had enough basics to know that self-education was his pathway to self-liberation. So by various means, he continued to teach himself to read, to write. And he learned that the little white schoolboys used this book, The Columbian Orator, and he managed to get himself a copy of this book. He kept it to his death. There's still 2 copies in his library in Washington. And this book contained great speeches, and he used these speeches as a way of not only teaching himself to be more literate, but learning how to phrase an argument. And he always said that the 2 speeches he liked particularly in this book were by Irishmen, Irish patriots, who he was very impressed that even though they were Protestant, they fought for the rights of Catholics. So very early on, he had an engagement with Ireland. He knew he couldn't be enslaved, and he plotted a few times to escape, and finally in 1838 he escaped to the northern states successfully, and he was only 20 years old, which is incredible. And he was helped in this escape by a free Black woman, Anna Murray, and she did this at great risk to herself. She got him a sailor's outfit and false sailor's papers, and he arrived in New York and he called for Anna. They married, and at that point, he changed his name to Douglas. And they could have gone to Canada. In Canada, they would have been safe, but Frederick said he wanted to remain in America and help other people achieve liberation. So instead, they moved to New Bedford, where Frederick worked on the docks. And they moved to New Bedford because New Bedford was a Quaker community, and Quakers were in the forefront of resisting slavery. So Frederick is free just at a time that the American abolitionist movement is entering a new radical phase. And that radical phase is associated with William Lloyd Garrison. And William Lloyd Garrison, like many Black abolitionists, knew the power of media. And in 1831, he'd started his own newspaper, The Liberator. And Garrison was a great admirer of an Irish abolitionist, Daniel O'Connell, and pretty well every weekly edition of The Liberator referred to this great Irish hero. So O'Connell, from the 1820s, O'Connell had really become the leading transatlantic figure. He succeeded William Wilberforce, who had led the first phase and more moderate phase of abolition. And from the 1820s, every time Daniel O'Connell made a speech, whatever the subject was, he would refer to slavery in America and describe it as a blot on the democracy. And he was at the radical end of the movement. He wanted immediate, total abolition. And not all abolitionists wanted that. He was also fighting for the rights of Catholics in Ireland, and in 1829 he achieved Catholic emancipation, which meant Catholics could sit in the British Parliament. And as a member of the British Parliament, O'Connell immediately fought for the abolition of slavery in the British Empire. And this was achieved in 1833 and held up as a model to America. This could happen in Britain, why not elsewhere? So if you don't know the great Daniel O'Connell, he was born in County Kerry to a Catholic family. At that point, Catholics were subject to various controls and lack of civil rights. There was no university in Ireland where Catholics could be educated, so he was educated in France. If he'd been born a few years earlier, he could not have been a lawyer. But due to his being born 1775, he was able as a Catholic to train as a lawyer, and he was a very brilliant lawyer. And he rejected the use of violence for political ends, and throughout his life he used just legal and constitutional means to win political ends. And what's amazing about him, as he was fighting for the poor, oppressed Catholics in Ireland, he was championing the oppressed everywhere else in the world. And if you don't know Irish history, Ireland had been a colony of Britain since the 12th century. And people who wanted independence in Ireland used the language of servitude. And this is this is Daniel saying here, that my early years have been darkened by the dreariness of servitude. So that was how Irish people viewed themselves. And this is the island into which Frederick arrives, an island that for almost 700 years had sought to win independence, and an island that was increasingly impoverished and underwent famines every few years. And as we know, Frederick arrived in 1845 at the very start of what was to become the Great Hunger, or the Great Famine, in which 1 million people, Irish people, perished. So, how does Frederick hear of the great Daniel O'Connell? In 1838, there was a new American ambassador to London, and O'Connell refused to shake the hand of any American until he knew his stance on the slavery question. He already knew Stevenson's stance. Stevenson owned slaves. And O'Connell refused to shake his hand of this American ambassador. And Stevenson was furious. It was a public humiliation, and he challenged O'Connell to a duel. O'Connell refused to fight it, but this issue was played out in the newspapers in Britain, in Ireland, and in America, and it polarized opinion. It was even debated in the American Congress. So Stevenson was very, very humiliated. But Frederick later said that in the curses of his masters and those who hated this interfering Irishman, he knew that if he ever met him, he would love him. And he later said that one of the reasons he stayed in Ireland so long was to meet his hero, Daniel O'Connell. So this new radical movement is taking place, and I don't have time to talk about it, but there were a number of other brilliant Black abolitionists also emerging in America, and many of them also made their way to both Britain and Ireland. So Frederick is getting involved in the abolitionist movement. He's starting to read the Liberator newspaper, and in 1841, he is invited to the largest abolitionist meeting ever, a 3-day meeting on the island of Nantucket. And at one point he's asked, because he is unusual, he is somebody who has known enslavement firsthand, and he's asked will he get up and say his life story. He later wrote that his knees were shaking, but he got up and he delivered a magnificent speech. And one of the people in the audience was William Lloyd Garrison. And William Lloyd Garrison saw the potential and the brilliance of the young Frederick Douglass, and he offered him a job as a lecturer for the American Anti-Slavery Society. So for the next few years, Frederick traveled around North America, lecturing on behalf of the Anti-Slavery Society. People doubted him. People said, how can this young man really be self-educated? He's too brilliant, and he was brilliant. And so to prove people wrong, in 1845, Frederick produced his life story, the famous narrative. And it was a double-edged sword, because while it propelled him to even greater notoriety within the abolition movement, it meant he was in danger of capture. And in the film, we saw the Fugitive Slave Act. The first one was introduced in 1794, and then an even more draconian one in 1850. But as Frederick knew, he was safe in no part of the United States. So at this point, he was persuaded to travel across the Atlantic. And this was a tough decision because he was married to Anna and they had 4 small children. For Garrison, though, the advantage was his superstar would go and consolidate the bonds of transatlantic slavery. So in August, Frederick sailed initially to Liverpool. He stayed in Liverpool for 2 days and then he travelled to Ireland. He intended to stay in Ireland for 4 days because a Quaker abolitionist had said he would reprint the narrative to give Frederick income to live in while he was in Ireland in exile. But Frederick was made to feel so welcome, he stayed for 4 months. The very first night he arrived in Ireland, he wrote to Garrison saying he was safe in old Ireland. And again, this was a new experience for Frederick to feel safe. And so he arranged for his narrative to be published. 2,000 copies were printed and they sold out within a few weeks. And so another Irish edition of the narrative was published. And through the editions of the narrative, you really see Frederick gaining in confidence and gaining agency because he wants to control his message. In the second Irish edition, he no longer wants the preface to be written by a white person. He wants to write his own preface. So Frederick is really controlling his own story. And after only 2 weeks of being in Ireland, he writes to Garrison. And he writes that everywhere in Ireland he has looked for examples of prejudice, but he can't find it. And this really astonishes him. He says, I find myself not treated as a colour, but as a man, not as a thing, but as a child of the common father of us all. And for Frederick, this is again very liberating, because not only for the first time in his life is he safe, for the first time in his life, he experiences what it feels like to be an equal. And this is something he never experiences again. So he uses the word transformative. Highlights the visit. There were many highlights of Frederick's visit. When he was in Dublin, he met his great hero, Father Matthew. Frederick was a great temperance man. He didn't believe in drinking. And Father Matthew was the Irish apostle of temperance. So Frederick took the pledge again not to drink. The Lord Mayor of Dublin introduced Frederick a few times when Frederick spoke, and he invited Frederick to dine in the Mansion House, the home of the Lord Mayor of Dublin. But of course, the greatest highlight was on the 29th of September when he heard his great hero, Daniel O'Connell, speak. And again, he went back that night and he wrote to Garrison, I have heard many speakers within the last 4 years, speakers of the first order, but I confess, I have never heard one by whom I was more completely captivated than by Mr. O'Connell. His power over an audience is perfect. And that is the building in which they met. It was crowded, 3,000 people, and Frederick was standing at the back. But when Daniel finished speaking and sat down, people started to leave. And so Frederick made his way to the front of the auditorium and was introduced to John O'Connell. And John said, you must meet my father. And Daniel then called on the audience not to leave, but to hear this young visitor from America. And so the 27-year-old Frederick is called on stage to speak alongside his hero. And we cannot leave the speech out. This is one of his finest speeches. And again, it's an impromptu speech, which tells you just how gifted he was as an orator. The poor, trampled slave of Carolina had heard the name of the liberator with joy and hope, and he himself had heard the wish that some black O'Connell would yet rise up amongst his countrymen and cry, agitate, agitate, agitate. And that really became a mantra very much associated with Frederick's idea that power concedes nothing without a struggle. So Frederick was in Dublin for a month. He then was asked to lecture elsewhere. He lectured in Wexford, Waterford, Youghal, Cork, Limerick and Belfast. And when he left Cork, there was a party for him. And again, he writes to Garrison, talking about the lack of prejudice and how it was so happy. In fact, he was so happy at the end of the evening, he entertained everybody there by just singing. He was very musical. Frederick left Ireland January 1846. And again, he wrote saying, "I can truly say I have spent some of the happiest moments of my life since landing in this country." From Ireland, he travelled to Scotland and then on to England, but he was increasingly homesick. And finally, in April 1847, he was able to return to the United States. Some women abolitionists in England, helped by Irish women abolitionists, had purchased his freedom, a concept that was pretty controversial at the time. And what's interesting is that shortly after Frederick's return, he moves away from Garrison. Both physically, he moves to Rochester, and ideologically. And Frederick, against the advice of Garrison, starts his own newspaper, the North Star. And as we heard, Frederick is a great women's rights man, and in 1848 he attended the Seneca Falls Convention, and he was one of the few men brave enough to sign the Declaration of Sentiments. So I'm jumping forward because I know I'm short of time, but after the war, Frederick continued to lecture, and his theme was the struggle for equality. He knew the 1863 proclamation ending slavery did not bring equality or end racism, so those became his big fights after the war. And in March 1867, he visited Winona and St. Paul. And again, just as an example of the prejudice he encountered throughout his life in the United States, in Winona, the hotel refused to allow him to stay. And he wrote, racism was in the air, and men breathed it and were permeated by it often when they were quite unconscious of its presence. So in 1889, Frederick accepted the position to be Consul General in Haiti. And Haiti had been a colony of Spain and then of France in the late 18th century. It was the richest island in the world, but inspired by events in America and events in France in the 1790s, it had its own revolution, and it became the first Black republic in the world. And America, Britain, France shunned it, and France imposed very high economic penalties on it. And so Haiti gradually became one of the most impoverished areas in the country. And Frederick was fascinated by this first Black republic, and so he went to Haiti. He stayed for 2 years, and he resigned in protest because America wanted to colonize part of Haiti again. And one of Frederick's finest speeches, I believe, is his speech on Haiti in 1893. And he starts off, "My subject is Haiti, the Black Republic, the only self-made Black republic in the world. It was once said by the great Daniel O'Connell that the history of Ireland might be traced, like a wounded man through a crowd, by the blood. The same may be said of the history of Haiti as a free state. Her liberty was born in blood, cradled in misfortune, and has lived more or less in a storm of revolutionary turbulence." And so you can see, almost 50 years later, the influence of Daniel O'Connell and of Ireland is still present in Frederick's thinking. And again, as we've seen, Frederick frequently referred to his time in Ireland when a young man. And we heard this in the film, but he was called the Liberator, and not without cause. For though he failed to effect a repeal of the union between England and Ireland, he fought out the battle of Catholic emancipation and was clearly the friend of liberty the world over. In introducing me to an immense audience in Conciliation Hall, he playfully called me the Black O'Connell of the United States. Nor did he let the occasion pass without his usual word of denunciation of our slave system. So Frederick died 20th of February 1895. In true fashion, that day he had attended a meeting on women's suffrage, and the women gave him a standing ovation. He came home to have dinner with his second wife, Helen, and he was leaving for another meeting in the evening, and while in the hall, waiting for a carriage, he suffered an enormous heart attack and sadly died. And he was 77 years old. And Ireland, as you can see, has not forgotten Frederick. There are plaques to him in Cork and in Waterford. There's a petition to rename a street in Cork after him. And just last weekend, it was announced that Belfast have agreed to erect a statue to Frederick Douglass. And in Belfast, there is a mural, which is on what is called a peace wall. These walls were built to separate Catholics from Protestants, and now they are giving out messages of international solidarity. And you might recognize some of these people surrounding Frederick. And in 2014, a new person was added to this wall, and it was the great late John Lewis. And so I think I will end at that point, and thank you very much.
I would love to say I could listen to you all day long, and clearly 20 minutes is not sufficient to hear about this extraordinary man and this extraordinary life and the resonance that everything he did and said has to carry us on through today. But the voices that I'm interested in hearing from are here with us today. We'll take some time to go with our panelists. You guys, where does this leave you? We'll start with Dennis. Dennis Brownlee, please.
Well, good evening, and thank you, Natalie and Consul General Byrne, for inviting me to join this discussion about Frederick Douglass tonight. I'm really honored to be a part of it, and I have to say I am awed and inspired every time I hear Christine talk about Frederick Douglass. I'd like to start by just saying a few words about the African-American Irish Diaspora Network. Our mission is to foster relationships between African Americans and Ireland through shared heritage and culture. It's estimated that roughly a third of African Americans have some Irish ancestry, and we want to build a community through which Irish and African Americans can connect not only through that ancestry, but also via culture, spirit, and other affinities. The idea to form the organization actually came about as a small group of us were engaged in starting to plan some events to commemorate the 175th anniversary of Frederick Douglass's trip to Ireland. We came to realize that it represented an opportunity to bring the African American and Irish communities together to work toward positive social change in the spirit of Frederick Douglass and Daniel O'Connell. The organization was formally launched on February 26th this year at an event hosted by Consul General of Ireland in New York, Kieran Madden, at his official residence. It's significant that the celebration and commemoration of this anniversary of Frederick Douglass's trip to Ireland and the mission of freedom and social justice that he shared with Daniel O'Connell is taking place this year, when we have seen a tidal wave of protests around the world against oppression and a demand for social justice and civil rights for all people, and a demand to end all forms of racial discrimination. Now, these are the same things that existed in some form or fashion back in 175 years ago that Frederick Douglass was fighting against, and they still exist to some extent today. And it is the hope of those of us associated with the African-American Irish Diaspora Network that the focus on this anniversary will help further galvanize the movement in the spirit of Frederick Douglass and Daniel O'Connell to fight for civil rights and equality for all people throughout the world. I want to take a moment to recognize people who worked on Agitate. It was written by Christine Kinealy and our fellow board member, Linwood Sloan. And, you know, we owe a great deal of credit to Christine for all of the lectures that she has transcribed from Frederick Douglass that were such an important part of that film. Rebecca Abbott, the Emmy Award-winning producer of the documentary Ireland's Great Hunger and the Irish Diaspora, was also a writer of Agitate, 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 and she also edited the film. I'd like to also recognize Nettie Washington Douglas, Frederick's great-great-granddaughter, another one of our AAIDN board members, for her inspired and very special narration, and Ian Gray, who did such a wonderful job of voicing Frederick's speeches in the film. The version that you saw is the longer 7-minute version, and there's also a 3-minute version that we cut for social media. Both are actually teasers for a full feature-length documentary that we have in development and hope to complete next year. That extended film will set the stage for another project that we are very excited about, which is a tourism and heritage trail that we are developing to follow Frederick's journey through Ireland. And it will be known as Frederick Douglass Way and connect with other tourism heritage trails in Ireland, the National Famine Way and the Great Atlantic Way. And as a companion to Frederick Douglass Way, we are developing the Frederick Douglass Trail in the US. I think the bottom line, as far as we're concerned right now, is that there is an opportunity for all of us in celebrating this anniversary to really work harder and use all of our energies to try to achieve the goals that Frederick Douglass set out 175 years ago when he gained his agency in Ireland to work for peace and social justice and the greater humanity for the benefit of people all over the world. And I'll end there, and then I'm sure we'll have more to say during the discussion with the other panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dennis. Grace, will you take us away here?
Yes, hi. I am totally in the space of I'm juggling 10 different hats. I'm juggling my Irish Black woman hat, my Irish Community Services Youth and Family Engagement Coordinator hat, my mom hat, my just general woman hat. I think a lot of things in that documentary or in that video and in what Christine just talked about, it's completely new news to me. And so I kind of feel like I should be one of these people who's actually watching us, but I'm very happy to actually be here and talking about it. Again, like I said about the hats, I'm gonna try and not be too unprofessional and just be me. And also I'm gonna try and just kind of get a balance of it, I guess. But there were some things that really stuck out for me when I was watching it. And, you know, some of the things that he said about the songs of the slave, and it just reminded me of like how much singing is such a huge part of Irish culture. And even if you can't sing, everyone sings. You know, there's never a moment in an Irish session or just in an Irish home where people are like, shut up, stop singing. And so it just really stuck out to me. Also, the when he said that he was not okay, he said racism was in the air and men were breathing it in unconsciously. And I feel like that's what has happened, especially, you know, in the world today. So, you know, he didn't feel like a colored man when he went to Ireland. Yet as a Black Irish woman, I can tell you I've definitely felt like a colored person in Ireland. And I feel like that sentence sums it up. It's that racism is in the air and people breathe it in unconsciously. And I think, if anything, that's what we're trying to, first of all, point out right now to people, is that you may not think that you're being racist, or you may not think that your thoughts are racist, but it's in the air and you're breathing it in unconsciously.
That was beautiful, Grace. Thank you so much. And I think that is one of the pieces that I found most poignant myself, and that's a perfect point to come to E.G. Bailey as an artist, spoken word person. Would you reflect in your own way, or jump up off what Grace was saying there?
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said. Frederick Douglass has always been an inspiration. You know, I was born in Liberia, grew up there till I was 10, and came to the U.S. And I was supposed to be in 4th grade, but because of the educational system, I was actually at a kindergarten level. And so it took me a whole summer of tutoring with my father to get up to a remedial fourth grade level, and so for me, he was one of the beacons of light in showing how reading and education can really free you. When I came, only my father could understand me. I spoke Liberian English, and even within my own family, it was difficult for my family to understand me. But I became very attached to books and to reading, and I knew people like Frederick became inspirations in that I knew if I could master the English language, I could master the culture. There was just something, I don't know how I felt that at a young age, except for examples like Frederick Douglass and being able to read and really make yourself through the act of learning how to read and the act of writing. And I feel like part of being an artist all these years, being when you start out, you write terrible poetry that nobody should ever see. But in that process of learning to read and write, you make who you are. And that's the example that Frederick Douglass set for me, that you can make yourself, make your destiny, gain your freedom. Because for me, even though it wasn't, we can talk about levels of freedom in this society, but I didn't come as an unfree person, but I was still unfree in spirit. I was still unfree in ability. I was still unfree in the scope of who I could be without knowing how to read and write, and gaining that ability to be able to do that, and learning how to write poetry and express my true thoughts and feelings really freed my spirit. And I was struck too by, how, in terms of legacy, you look at Frederick Douglass going to Ireland and talking about the fact that, he was treated not as a color, but as a man. And you look at James Baldwin, you look at Richard Wright when they went to France, the freedom that they were able to feel because they were recognized for their humanity for the first time in their lives. And so for me, Douglass has always been that example. I look at, in the same way Equiano gained his freedom and liberation through the act of reading. And so I look at it as, talking books, and books being able to talk to you, and you being able to talk back to the books and have this relationship with words. And how much of a voice and how beautiful of a writer Douglass was, and a philosopher, and how much he could express himself through language. And that's part of what I love about gaining the knowledge of reading and gaining the knowledge of writing, and being able to express myself as a poet. And yeah, it was very. And he's an icon. I don't know if we're related, but that was always one of the things, when I learned his last name was Bailey, I would get excited. I'd be like, maybe somehow we are related. And it just made him even more of a hero. I have a little secret hope. It's like Oprah Winfrey wanting to be South African. I want to be related to Frederick Douglass. But nonetheless, I still hold him as an icon and believe that I'm related by spirit. And just a incredible, powerful man. And learning something, even like, when I'm reading the biography, the most recent biography, and it begins talking about how he spoke at the dedication of Lincoln's memorial. There was a statue, the 11th year anniversary of his death, and how he wasn't afraid to speak truth to power. Even at that time, and even before presidents and dignitaries, he just had an unwavering courage and a self-possession of being a man of character, and that's part of what I love about him. And I think he was an example for others, like Martin Luther King and Robert Hayden wrote an amazing, beautiful poem about Frederick Douglass. So I could literally go on and continue talking, but I know we have other things to discuss and answer. But he's truly a incredible hero of mine.
Thank you so much, E.G. It's funny, it was you that I was thinking of when Christine was describing Frederick's oratory book and how he had the value of that small book and of the words, and that anchored him, and that gave him so much, and to see that being some of his final possessions was so touching. I'll open the floor here. I'd love to hear from you guys. Christine, I saw you nodding away through a good deal of it. Consul General, how do we take this narrative and this inspiration and the resonance of what Frederick Douglass is and unravel that narrative for today? Where do we take this now, and what else can we do? Or any thoughts that you want to jump in, please do.
I think what E.G. said about the character of the man is something we should take heart from and inspiration from, because he was so truthful to himself. I love the fact he's so inclusive. He doesn't have bitterness. You may know that towards, I think it was 1877, he went and met the man who'd been his master, I put that in inverted commas, who was an old man who was dying. And they both sat at his former master was on a bed dying, and they held hands and they were both crying. And it was just, and then Frederick wrote about it afterwards, and he said, it wasn't you, it was the system, so I forgive you. And that notion that you wanted to brutalize me through slavery, but in fact, you were the one who was brutalized because of this system. So I just think his insight, his compassion, his forgiveness, his inclusivity, we should draw inspiration from them today. I don't know what else to say except
I wonder, perhaps we could turn to Grace. You work in the arts, you work with theater and with drama as healing and as therapy. We're a Center for the Arts, so I think the arts have a great deal to play in this and in this conversation and taking us forward. Could you speak
100%.
to that?
I'm actually a trained drama therapist, so I can definitely speak to arts and therapy and the healing process and how important this is, and how important we all need to look to our art. Like when we use art, we connect to a part of ourselves it's not something that we connect to every day. It brings us back to this childhood feeling. It brings us back to the playfulness. It enables us to be, to experience, and to accept things for what they are without, I keep that sentence just keeps coming back into my head about, racism being in the air. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. Racism being in the air and us, people breathing it in. Well, how about we get some anti-racism in the air and allow people to breathe that in? And that comes through art and experiencing and seeing and respecting and be using the art and whatever is in front of you and allowing that to change you from the inside.
Thank you.
I'd like to say also that I think it was significant, kind of following up on what Grace was saying about, the era of racism, that Frederick and the other abolitionists realized even before abolition of slavery was achieved, that the real struggle was going to be for equal rights. And, I think that that's something that we have to keep in mind, that we are still struggling for that today. And I think that's so significant. And I know that Ireland is now becoming a very diverse country itself. And, Ireland wants to be that kind of environment that existed, that was so welcoming to Frederick Douglass and the other abolitionists. But it is indeed struggling on some levels with that era of racism that you have described, Grace. And I think all of us who are involved in these celebrations have to keep that in mind and have a commitment to attack that racism and that oppression wherever and however we can.
Thank you, Dennis. Consul General, I think we had a statistic that you mentioned. 1 in 6 people right now who live in Ireland were not born there. Obviously, things are changing. One of the mentions of the New York Consul General is that the government is ready to make changes and do better. Is this something that you could reflect on with us?
Yeah, thanks, Natalie, and yeah, just reflecting on everyone else's comments. I don't know if people could see me, but I was nodding away and taking down notes from what everybody was saying. And I think you said, what can we do? And I think we can do 2 things. One, learn from great scholars like Christine and the work that she's done, sort of bringing this history back to us and showing us, that we, where we've come from, and I suppose the lessons of great men and great women of the past. And I think the second thing is something Grace said, and it's about let's get some anti-racism in the air. After the murder of George Floyd, there was a wave of protest in Ireland, which was still under lockdown for COVID. And I think the thing that was quite encouraging from it was young people, young people from all across Ireland, and many of them, most of them white, saying that this isn't okay. This racial inequality isn't okay. And I think it also cast a light on Ireland as well. I think sometimes in Ireland we like to think that we're a great place to be, and there are no real problems, and isn't it all fine? And I think in a way it casts that light back on ourselves to ask those questions. We have a Black population in Ireland, we have a Black Irish population, and to sort of say, what is that experience like, and really to reflect on that experience. So I think it's opened up a space for conversations, and sometimes for difficult conversations. And I think that's something that we need to have more of, to really address, how our actions, affect those around us. So I think it's about having more conversations. And I think, hearing about the Frederick Douglass way, if we can all learn more about, Frederick Douglass and his example, if that can spark further conversations, I think that's really positive.
I'd like to say also that it is so easy to slip from the high moral ground. And this was one of the great frustrations of Daniel O'Connell when he saw how easily the Irish slipped from the high moral ground when they came to America. And, I think that we've experienced that over the past 4 years here in this country too, where we thought we had achieved a certain level of consciousness with the election of Barack Obama. And not to get political about it, but I think just in general that our society has slipped from a higher moral ground to a lower moral ground in the past 4 years. And we always have to be on guard for that. And we always have to be mindful of trying to achieve the best in us and influence others in that way as well.
And I think of Douglas's own experience, that by the end of his life, he Jim Crow had returned. So even after, it was just, it's sad to see that the fight, what he fought for and then achieved, or he thought he achieved, the same way, we thought we had achieved that moral ground with Barack, and then come to find, this insidiousness of racism, and that it just never goes away. The fight for equality and equal rights and truly human rights, because it's not just about equal rights. It's about human rights. It's a human right for us to be treated as people and treated with equality. I don't see that as equal rights or civil rights. That's a human right. We all should be treated as people of character, respected for our humanity, because we're all one race and all connected. There are cultural differences, but at the core, we are striving for the same thing. We experience the same thing, and so it's really about humanity. Yeah.
Thank you, E.G. It's different. I'm really enjoying all of you wearing these different hats and working through this conversation. It is hard to be so inspired and to see this historical tour de force in Frederick Douglass and to feel the slipping away from the high ground. Could any of you, else of you or others, speak to what we can do, what you'd like to see moving forward? What can the arts do in this? How do we step forward? And audience, just so you know, we are going to go a little bit over time on this. I hope everybody's all right with that. Dakota Dave, you're standing by. I think this is a really important place to get to. What can we do? Anyone? Kevin.
Tell the truth.
Thank you, Jim.
Go ahead. Yeah.
For me, it's simple. I think be true to yourself and true to your character, and speak the truth, and have the courage. And to me, that's the example that he set. He had character in all things, and spoke the truth even to the highest level of power, and was unwavering in that.
Speaking to the arts, Christine and I actually had a really engaging conversation this morning with an actor who plays George Washington in the production of Hamilton in one of the touring productions. And he commented that with the protests that we have just had, and all the young people coming out for those protests and the peaceful nature of those protests, that he couldn't help but think that much of the energy had been inspired by Hamilton, whether it was conscious or subconsciously, that it did have an influence. And so I think it goes back to the point that both Grace and E.G. were making about the importance of the arts in influencing people and influencing thinking. So, I think that I would encourage you, both of you, to continue what you're doing because it is so powerful. And the arts meant so much to Frederick Douglass as well, and all the abolitionists. And they employed the arts. They employed theatricality in what they did, in the lectures that they gave, and the tools that they used to communicate. And that was a big part of it. So that's the first thing. The second thing that we can do is vote.
Amen. Thank you, Kevin. I think you've been trying to slide in.
Yeah, sorry, and coming from that to the one person who can't vote, obviously, but just to say, yeah, and I just really want to underline that point around the arts. And I don't come from an arts background; I come from a sort of a politics background. But I suppose, and I always come back to this point of it's important to have these conversations and to share people's perspectives. And I think the wonderful thing about the arts is essentially what the arts is about is telling a story and sharing a perspective. And often it can do it in a way that can be sometimes subversive. So to draw people into a conversation or to share an experience that, if you went to somebody and said, I want you to learn about this, they might say no. But if you can do it in an engaging way through the arts and really raise those questions and ask people to, I suppose, to reflect on themselves, I think the power of the arts to do that is really important. So I think, yeah, exactly, to all the creatives, please keep doing what you're doing. It's so important to spark off these conversations and to keep, forcing people to reflect upon themselves and society and how we can do better. Thank you.
I just want to say one thing. Sorry, Natalie.
No,
I also think it's important that we reach our children. So I've been writing children's books. It's one thing that when I was a kid, there was never a children's book that had a girl who looked like me in it. It was always, and I know there are some who I feel like they're very like either white children's books or they're black children's books, but we need to have more interracial children's books, and also just in general children's books with people who look like the children that are growing up today, so that the children who are growing up today see themselves represented, and also the children who are white or black or whatever see that there are different hues of people, from different shades of eggshell to caramel to cocoa, whatever. Just keep teaching our children, educate our children, write children's books, write plays, write poems, listen, understand, connect.
Thank you so much, Grace. I think the most powerful part I'll take away from that is really to see ourselves in each other is one of the most powerful things we can do, to tell our stories and to share our experiences. There are some really, really good things happening along this line of conversation. A lot of it is being cultivated by the Irish Embassy and Consulate. We'll actually put up a series of links that I'd love for our audience to take your time, copy them down, or grab these links. We'll put them in now, and I'll give them a quick review. So the Embassy is wrapping up Black History Month and ongoing Frederick Douglass events. There's more to find out. There's quite a lot more going on. So visit the Embassy page. There's a brilliant website and a movement, I Am Irish, and that's promoting the awareness and the celebration of diversity as Irish people. So changing what people see as identity is a huge, important part, especially with the global Irish diaspora and the movement to expand the global footprint of what Irish is and who the Irish are. History Ireland has some amazing things that connect. The Irish Network Against Racism has amazing resources. There's a few other articles that we'll put in there, and right here at home, our International Institute of Minnesota, we can find places where there's really good work being done and connections being made while we tell our stories and write our books and stage our plays. This is a really great opportunity now. Dakota Dave, hopefully you're standing by, because you're going to have the mic in just a moment, to wrap up with one of the pieces that came from Frederick Douglass himself about the singing, and that the singing being misunderstood, and to sing to drown our sorrow, to sing to express ourselves, to sing to share what is sometimes unspeakable. That's art, and that's what it's here to do. It's here to show us who we are sometimes, who we'd like to be, and I think it's here to make us evolve. I think it's lovely that Frederick Douglass's paper was called The North Star. Of course, we here consider ourselves the North Star State in many ways, but it takes us right into Dakota Dave. The tune he's got for us is actually relating to the North Star. And Dave, perhaps you could go ahead and give us a little historical context. Meanwhile, we'll get those links up for everybody. If you have some questions, the question and answers are open. Thank you so much for being a part of this. Dakota Dave.
Hi, thank you for including me in this. It's really an honor to be with all these folks. I've learned an awful lot tonight that I didn't know already. This is a folk song that has come down, and it allegedly was directions for escaping slaves. in the years before the Civil War is Follow the Drinking Gourd. Thank you.
Dave, that was beautiful. Follow the drinking gourd. Folklore has that the drinking gourd, of course, was the Big Dipper and pointing toward the North Star. I hope everybody continues to follow their North Star and to continue to tell stories and share truths and see yourself in others. And keep finding your own North Star. Thank you so much to our panelists, particularly to our presenter, Christine, to Dennis, to Grace, to AG, to the Consul General, and of course, Dakota Dave Hull. Thank you for ending us with a little bit of art. Ladies and gentlemen and friends, go out, be safe, Slán Abhaile. I think that's the only way to end an Irish event. Thank you, everybody. Good night.